She was in agony, begging for help. Her fiancé collapsed crying outside her door. MGM executives pleaded with her mother, and a doctor with life-saving medicine waited 11 days in the hallway, forbidden to enter. Jean Harlow was 26 years old when Christian Science took her life, and Hollywood buried the truth for 87 years. The Golden Curtain of Silence, June 6, 1937. Jean Harlow, Hollywood's biggest sex symbol, MGM's highest-paid actress, America's platinum blonde, was gone at 26. The official story? Sudden illness. The truth? Her mother, Mama Jean Bello, had spent 11 days blocking doctors from treating a kidney infection because Christian Science taught the disease was illusion. By the time Mama Jean finally called an ambulance, Jean's organs were failing. William Powell, her fiancé, would never recover. Clark Gable cried in the hallway, helpless, but here's what Hollywood buried. Jean wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. For 80 years, Christian Science infiltrated Hollywood's elite, and the studios covered up every preventable death. Jean Harlow, the platinum blonde who passed away, calling for her mother. In early June of 1937, Jean Harlow stood at the absolute pinnacle of Hollywood success. At 26, she earned $5,000 per week, equivalent to over $100,000 today. Her platinum hair became the most imitated look in America. She was one of the most famous women on earth. What they didn't know was that Jean had spent her entire life under the absolute control of her mother, Mama Jean Carpenter Bello. Mama Jean had married young and badly. Now single and desperate, she discovered Christian Science in the early 1920s and embraced it with converts' fervor. For her, the faith offered something she'd never had: control. She raised her daughter according to strict Christian Science principles. Illness was never acknowledged. Doctors were spiritual enemies, even as adult. Jean became Hollywood's most desired woman. Mama Jean lived with her, managed every dollar of her finances, controlled her social calendar, and made all health decisions. Jean had internalized Mama Jean's teaching so thoroughly that questioning it seemed spiritually dangerous. On May 29, 1937, Jean was filming Saratoga with Clark Gable. That afternoon, Jean suddenly grabbed her side and doubled over. The studio doctor rushed over. Dr. Ernest Fishbaugh examined Jean right there on the soundstage. The diagnosis: acute nephritis, inflammation of the kidneys, entirely treatable with bed rest, fluids, and medication if addressed promptly. He strongly recommended hospitalization that day. Jean, frightened and in pain, wanted to go. "Mama, it really hurts," Jean said. Mama Jean's expression was calm, beatific even. "That's not real, darling. It's mortal error. Dr. Fishbaugh means well, but doctors don't understand spiritual truth. Prayer is the only medicine you need." Dr. Fishbaugh was appalled. "Mrs. Bello, your daughter has a serious kidney infection. Without treatment, this could become life-threatening within a week. We're leaving," Mama Jean said firmly. Over the next 10 days, a preventable tragedy unfolded in terrible slow motion. Jean's kidneys began to fail. Uremic poisoning spread through her system. She developed a fever. The fever climbed higher. Jean became delirious. Fluid began accumulating in her tissues. Her beautiful face bloated beyond recognition. Fluid filled her lungs. Each breath became a drowning. Clark Gable personally came to the house and begged Mama Jean to allow hospitalization. "Please," he said, tears streaming down his face. "She's fading. I can hear her from here." Mama Jean remained serene. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern, but Jean is in God's hands. Prayer will correct it." Inside the bedroom, witnesses later reported, she repeatedly called out, "Mama, please, it hurts. Please make it stop, Mama." Jean never wavered. Only when Jean lapsed into complete unconsciousness did Mama Jean finally consent to medical intervention. Jean was rushed to Good Samaritan Hospital. The doctors were appalled. This was an easily treatable kidney infection, allowed to progress untreated for 11 days. Had she been hospitalized when first recommended, she would have recovered completely. Instead, she was experiencing systemic organ failure. There was nothing they could do. On June 7, 1937, Jean Harlow passed away from cerebral edema caused by acute kidney failure. She was 26 years old, and she passed from an infection that penicillin would have cured in less than a week. Dr. Fishbaugh made a statement to the press. "This was an entirely preventable loss. Had Miss Harlow been hospitalized when I first recommended it, she would have lived." William Powell was destroyed. For years afterward, he visited her grave weekly bringing white roses. He never married, never stopped loving her. Mama Jean herself never publicly expressed regret. She lived another 21 years maintaining that Jean's apparent loss had been a spiritual triumph. But there's a detail that suggests Mama Jean's conviction may have been more complicated. After Jean passed away, Mama Jean never practiced Christian Science healing on others again. Jean Harlow's story was just the beginning. If you want to see how this pattern repeated itself across 8 decades of Hollywood history, affecting some of the biggest names you know, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happened to Marilyn Monroe, Robin Williams, and Val Kilmer will change how you see Hollywood forever. Let's continue. Marilyn Monroe, the orphan who learned love, was conditional. Some Christian Science stories don't start with a choice. Some start before you can even speak. Norma Jean Mortensen, the girl who would become Marilyn Monroe, never had a chance. Born June 1st, 1926, to Gladys Pearl Baker, a film negative cutter who worked at Consolidated Film Industries in Hollywood. Gladys was a Christian Scientist, not just a practitioner, an obsessive one. Gladys had married young and badly. Her first husband was abusive. After their divorce, he took both children and disappeared to Kentucky. Gladys never saw her son Robert again. He passed before they could reunite. For Gladys, this catastrophic loss needed spiritual explanation. Christian Science provided it. Matter, including her children, was illusion anyway. True reality was spiritual. When Norma Jean was born 3 years later, Gladys was already fracturing. The pregnancy was unplanned. The father wanted nothing to do with her or the baby. Gladys was alone, broke, and clinging to a faith that taught her suffering was her own fault. She placed infant Norma Jean with foster parents. In January 1934, Gladys had a complete mental breakdown, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and committed to Metropolitan State Hospital. Norma Jean, at 7 years old, was alone. Then, when she was 12, she went to live with Anna Lower, a devoted Christian Science practitioner. Unlike Gladys, Anna practiced with genuine warmth. She loved Norma Jean. She encouraged her dreams of acting. For a girl who had never experienced consistent maternal love, Anna's affection was intoxicating, and it came with a price: accepting Christian Science theology. Anna taught Norma Jean that her mother wasn't mentally ill. Mental illness was mortal error. Gladys was simply experiencing false beliefs that prayer could correct. The solution wasn't doctors or medication. Those would only make the false beliefs more real. Think about what this did to a 12-year-old girl. Your mother has been taken away. You don't understand why. And the woman who loves you explains that your mother isn't sick. She's just thinking wrong. Norma Jean learned that love was conditional on denying reality. 1946, 20-year-old Norma Jean signed her first film contract and became Marilyn Monroe. Anna Lower was thrilled. Christian Science taught that you could manifest reality through thought. Anna had thought it. Norma Jean had become it. But as Marilyn Monroe became famous, she also became more psychologically fragile. She struggled with insomnia, anxiety, and depression. She had multiple miscarriages. Her marriages failed. She became dependent on barbiturates and alcohol. And through it all, her mother remained institutionalized, still a devoted Christian Scientist. In letters from the hospital, Gladys signed herself, "As a Christian Scientist, I remain very truly your mother, not your loving mother, but as a Christian Scientist first, mother second." Marilyn had mostly rejected Christian Science by this point. She was seeing psychiatrists. When she married playwright Arthur Miller in 1956, she converted to Judaism. The conversion was deliberate. Judaism offered her something Christian Science never had: permission to acknowledge suffering, permission to grieve. But you can't erase childhood conditioning. You can reject a faith intellectually while still carrying its damage emotionally. When she passed in August 1962 at 36 from an overdose ruled probable self-harm, her mother Gladys was still institutionalized, still a Christian Scientist. And here's the detail that breaks your heart. After Marilyn's passing, Gladys wrote that she had been giving Marilyn Christian Science treatments for approximately a year before her passing. Treatments that consisted of denying the reality of Marilyn's suffering. Gladys thought she was helping. Christian Science taught her that denying illness was love. But it wasn't love. It was the same pattern that had defined Marilyn's entire life. Love that required her to pretend she was fine when she wasn't. Ginger Rogers, dancing in her mother's shadow. Jean Harlow passed away, begging her mother for help. The mother refused. Ginger Rogers was about to spend 50 years finding out what kind of love does that. And here's the thing nobody tells you. She's famous for dancing with Fred Astaire in 9 films, but she lived with her mother during all 5 of her marriages. Virginia Catherine McMath, known as Ginger Rogers, was already an established star when Jean Harlow passed away. At 26, Ginger had just completed Swing Time with Fred Astaire. Audiences saw effortless joy. They didn't see the iron control exercised by Layla Emma-Jean Owens Rogers, possibly the most powerful stage mother in Hollywood history. Layla worked as a talent scout for RKO Pictures, the very studio that employed Ginger. She wrote screenplays. She was respected in the industry, which made her control over Ginger even more insidious, because it wasn't just maternal neediness. It was strategic manipulation by someone who understood the Hollywood system intimately and used Christian Science as the theological framework to justify total control. Layla wielded Christian Science as spiritual authority. If Ginger questioned a career decision, Layla framed it as spiritual error. If Ginger wanted independence, Layla suggested such desires came from mortal mind, not divine guidance. During the filming of Swing Time, Ginger injured her knee executing one of the demanding routines. The knee swelled immediately. A studio doctor found significant inflammation, possibly a torn ligament. He strongly recommended rest and evaluation by an orthopedic specialist. Layla's response was immediate and absolute. The injury wasn't real. It was mortal error. Prayer, not doctors, would heal it. Ginger danced through the pain for the remainder of filming. Crew members later reported that between takes, she would lean against the wall with tears streaming down her face. The injury never properly healed. For the rest of her career, another 50 years of performing, she dealt with knee weakness. But most extraordinarily, Layla lived with Ginger during all 5 of her marriages. Ginger Rogers married 5 times between 1929 and 1961. In every single marriage, Layla had a permanent bedroom in Ginger's house. She appeared at breakfast every morning. She weighed in on every decision. Ginger's second husband, Lou Ayres, later said, "I married Ginger, but Layla came with the package. I'd wake up in the morning, go to the kitchen for coffee, and there would be my mother-in-law already at the table every morning for 2 years." When he suggested Layla get her own apartment nearby, the marriage ended. Ayres later said, "I didn't leave Ginger, I left Layla, but you couldn't have one without the other." Layla didn't pass away until 1960. 1977, when she was 86 and Ginger was 66. Only then, at 66, did Ginger begin figuring out who she was without her mother. Friends who knew Ginger in her final decades described a woman profoundly conflicted about her mother's legacy. When Ginger Rogers wrote her autobiography in 1991, the silence continued. The book mentioned Christian Science only in passing. The most revealing moment is also the briefest. Ginger writes that after Layla passed away, she felt both grief and a strange sensation of lightness. But that one sentence contains everything: grief and lightness, loss and relief, sorrow and freedom. Joan Crawford, the perfectionist who found God in control. Joan Crawford found Christian Science as an adult and embraced it precisely because it promised the one thing she craved most: absolute control. Lucille Fay LeSueur was born sometime between 1904 and 1908 in San Antonio, Texas. Joan Crawford demanded control over every narrative, every image, every perception. Christian Science would give her theological justification for that control. Lucille's early years were marked by poverty, instability, and her parents' violent marriage. Her father abandoned the family. Lucille was sent to work as a servant for a wealthy family while still a child. She later described being mistreated and humiliated. In 1925, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer signed her to a contract and renamed her Joan Crawford. She became one of the biggest stars of Hollywood's golden age, but underneath was a woman consumed by anxiety about losing control. She had come from nothing. She could return to nothing. The only way to prevent that was to control everything. By the 1950s, she was attending Christian Science services regularly. For Joan, Christian Science offered something intoxicating: the teaching that you could control reality through thought. But it also gave her spiritual authority for something darker: controlling other people. Joan adopted 5 children between 1940 and 1947. Joan's household was run with military precision. Any deviation resulted in punishment, sometimes verbal, sometimes physical. Christina Crawford, Joan's eldest adopted daughter, later described the mistreatment in her memoir, Mommy Dearest, published a year after Joan's passing. The most famous scene involved Joan discovering wire hangers in Christina's closet. Joan flew into a rage, screaming, "No wire hangers ever!" and striking Christina while the other children watched in terror. Joan had grown up poor. Wire hangers represented poverty, lack of control, chaos. Finding them in her home triggered something primal, and here's where Christian Science enters the picture. Christian Science teaches that matter is illusion. For Joan Crawford, this meant, if I maintain perfect control over my appearance, my home, my children's behavior, I can prevent the poverty and chaos of my childhood from ever touching me again. If I acknowledge imperfection, I make it real. Christina describes Joan reading Mary Baker Eddy's writings aloud, insisting the children understand Christian Science principles. Pain wasn't real. Suffering was mortal error. If the children were unhappy, it was because they were thinking incorrectly. Joan Crawford passed believing she had been a wonderful mother. Christian Science taught her that belief creates reality, so in her consciousness, she was wonderful. The mistreatment was illusion. The children's suffering was mortal error. Christina Crawford is now 95 years old. When interviewers ask about her mother's Christian Science faith, Christina's answer is measured. It gave her a framework to deny responsibility. It told her that what she was doing wasn't real, so she never had to face what she'd done. Joan Crawford's story is different from the others. She wasn't a victim of Christian Science. It gave her tools to damage others. Audrey Hepburn, starvation, faith, and the question that haunted her. Some Christian Science stories aren't about mothers controlling daughters. Sometimes the faith itself asks the impossible question: when you're starving and near passing, is hunger real or an illusion to be prayed away? Audrey Kathleen Rustin, who would become Audrey Hepburn, was born in Brussels on May 4, 1929, to Baroness Ella van Heemstra, a Dutch aristocrat and devout Christian Science practitioner. For young Audrey, Christian Science was simply the framework through which she understood reality. From her first scraped knee to her first stomach ache, Audrey learned that the pain wasn't real. It was mortal error. When Germany invaded the Netherlands in May 1940, Audrey was 11. Then came the Hunger Winter of 1944 to 1945. The occupiers retaliated against Dutch resistance with a food embargo. Official rations dropped to between 400 and 500 calories per day. By winter, people were eating tulip bulbs as survival. Approximately 22,000 Dutch civilians perished from starvation. Audrey, 15 and 16 during those months, survived on a diet that would have horrifying long-term consequences. In her mother's collection of Christian Science literature, there were books explaining that physical deprivation was illusion. Audrey's weight dropped to approximately 88 pounds. She was 5 feet 7 inches tall. At 88 pounds on that frame, she was skeletal. She suffered severe malnutrition, affecting every system. Her period stopped. Her hair fell out. Her teeth loosened. Her bones became brittle. And here is the question that haunted Audrey Hepburn for the rest of her life. Did Christian Science teaching help her survive or make survival harder? On one hand, Audrey demonstrated extraordinary mental toughness. She danced in secret performances for the Dutch resistance. A 16-year-old girl weighing 88 pounds, still finding the strength to perform. But the other side is darker. If hunger is error, does seeking food become spiritually dangerous? Did teenage Audrey struggle not just with finding food, but with allowing herself to acknowledge that she desperately needed it? We don't know. Audrey herself never publicly discussed Christian Science, but we can read Audrey's actions, and her actions provide an answer. When Allied forces liberated the Netherlands in May 1945, 16-year-old Audrey was grievously malnourished and required months of medical intervention. She accepted that medical care immediately, without hesitation. When Audrey became a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador in 1988, she chose one mission: feeding starving children and providing medical care to those in need. This work was the opposite of Christian Science's approach. Where Christian Science taught that matter was illusion, Audrey's UNICEF advocacy insisted that children's physical suffering was heartbreakingly real. In Ethiopia, 1988, she visits feeding stations where children arrive with the same distended bellies and stick-thin limbs she had once had. She kneels beside them and she weeps. UNICEF workers reported that she would hold these children and whisper, "You're going to be okay. We're going to feed you." The 15-year-old girl, who once weighed 88 pounds and ate tulip bulbs, had become a woman who spent her final years trying to save the starving child she had been. Audrey Hepburn spent 40 years proving suffering was devastatingly, heartbreakingly, materially real. When Audrey was diagnosed with cancer in September 1992, she received aggressive medical treatment. Her sons encouraged this treatment. There is no indication that anyone suggested Christian Science prayer as an alternative. Audrey Hepburn passed away on January 20th, 1993. She was 63. Her memorial service made no mention of Christian Science, but that silence wasn't emptiness. It was her answer. Audrey Hepburn's silence about Christian Science was the loudest statement she ever made. Doris Day, "Que sera sera," and the price of unwavering faith. Doris Day's silence about Christian Science would become isolation so profound that she couldn't speak her departed son's name for 11 years. Doris Marianne Kappelhoff was born in Cincinnati, Ohio, on April 3, 1922, into a devout Christian Science household. Unlike others whose mothers discovered the faith as adults, Doris was raised in Christian Science from infancy. She practiced it for 97 years without apparent break or doubt. Her signature song, Que sera, sera, whatever will be, became in many ways an anthem of Christian Science philosophy. For Doris, this was her sincere religious conviction. Whatever will be, will be. Don't question, don't grieve. The first major test came in 1968 when her husband, Martin Melcher, passed away suddenly. Within days, Doris discovered that Martin and his business partner had embezzled virtually her entire fortune. 20 years of earnings, approximately $20 million, lost. Christian Science teaching held that material wealth was ultimately illusory. So she didn't grieve the betrayal. She smiled because Christian Science required it. And then came the second and far more devastating test. In 2004, Doris's only child, Terry Melcher, passed away from melanoma at age 62. After Terry was gone, something changed in Doris. She essentially withdrew from public life. Her last interview was in 2008. After that, silence. Those who knew her described her as emotionally isolated, rarely speaking about Terry even to close friends. Not in a healthy way where she'd processed the grief. In an unhealed way where the wound remained open but couldn't be discussed. Think about that. Your only child passes away at 62. You have 11 years left to live, and you spend those 11 years barely mentioning his name, because your faith teaches you that dwelling on his loss gives power to the illusion of passing. That grief is mortal error. Doris's animal advocacy became her emotional outlet. She could cry over injured dogs. She could rage about animal mistreatment, but she couldn't cry about Terry. That would be acknowledging that his loss was real. Doris Day maintained her Christian Science faith until her own passing on May 13, 2019, at age 97. Her extraordinary longevity is sometimes cited by Christian Science practitioners as evidence of the faith's benefits. But longevity isn't the same as living. Doris lived to 97, but Jean's suffering lasted 11 days. Doris's lasted 11 years. The years after Terry was gone, when she was forbidden by her faith from acknowledging the loss that destroyed her. Carol Burnett, the comedian who learned laughter, was the only medicine allowed. Carol Burnett's grandmother would roll up a copy of the Christian Science, monitor, press it against her stomach, and tie string around her waist. When 7-year-old Carol asked why, her grandmother explained, "So my insides won't fall out." The same grandmother who believed bodies weren't real was terrified her internal organs would spill onto the floor. Carol Creighton Burnett was born April 26, 1933, in San Antonio, Texas. Her alcoholic parents abandoned her for Hollywood, leaving Carol with her grandmother, Mae White, in a one-room apartment in Depression-era Los Angeles. Mae White was a hypochondriacal Christian scientist, a woman convinced she was dying while belonging to a faith that taught death was illusion. Every day, Nanny would feel her pulse obsessively, panic about her heart, grab Mary Baker Eddy's textbook, and tell Carol to know the truth. Carol would pray, deny what she was seeing, convince herself that Nanny's terror wasn't real. And when prayer didn't work, Nanny would send Carol to the medicine cabinet packed with phenobarbital. If Mary Baker Eddy couldn't fix it, pharmaceuticals would. Down the hall, Carol's mother fought constantly with Nanny about money, about Carol's father, who occasionally appeared before vanishing. The screaming was relentless. Carol would sit in the corner and draw. She created the Josephsons, a perfect imaginary family where nobody screamed, nobody drank, nobody needed newspapers to keep their insides from falling out. When reality is unbearable, create something else. When pain is forbidden, make it funny. When Carol was 13, her mother stopped attending Christian Science services, no explanation. But 13 years of conditioning doesn't erase because you stop going to church. Carol had learned emotions aren't real. Suffering is error. Acknowledging pain makes it worse. Deny it exists. Or make everyone laugh so they don't look too closely. Carol got a scholarship to UCLA, discovered theater, and landed a role in Broadway's Once Upon a Mattress. 1959. In 1967, CBS gave her a variety show. The Carol Burnett Show ran for 11 seasons, won 25 Emmy Awards, became appointment television for 30 million Americans. Carol was beloved, warm, funny, fearless, America's sweetheart. But watch the recurring sketches, particularly Eunice, the bitter, frustrated woman constantly fighting with her mother, trapped in patterns she can't escape. Carol put her own mother into that character. The if only, the I could have, the sense that life should have been different. The show's other recurring bit, a bickering family where nobody says what they mean, where feelings get masked as jokes, where pain has to be funny or else it's unbearable. Carol took her traumatic childhood, repackaged it as entertainment, and made millions laugh. She was doing exactly what Christian Science taught her: transform pain into something else. Just don't acknowledge that it hurts. In 1986, Carol published her memoir, One More Time. It's funny, warm, full of anecdotes about Nanny's eccentricities, the phenobarbital, the newspaper around the waist, every painful moment softened with humor, every trauma reframed as quirky. When interviewers ask about her childhood, Carol's answers are always measured. It wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't miserable. She'll describe the poverty, the alcoholism, but always with the caveat that others had it worse, that she was fine. In 2002, Carol's daughter Carrie died of cancer at age 38. Carol has spoken about it in interviews, but always carefully, always controlled. Grief exists, but it's managed, presented in doses that don't overwhelm. She never breaks. She never lets the pain be ugly or raw. At 91, Carol Burnett still gives interviews, still tells stories about Nanny with that same warm humor, still making people laugh at dysfunction that should make them cry. Christian Science taught Carol that suffering was mortal error. She rejected the theology, but she kept the coping mechanism: deny reality, perform wellness, make everyone comfortable. The little girl drawing the Josephsons became America's most beloved comedian by perfecting what Christian Science demanded. She made pain funny, and 88 years later, she still can't stop. If Carol Burnett's story resonates with you, not necessarily about Christian Science, but about learning to perform happiness while hurting, drop a comment below. How many of us learned that showing pain was weakness? That the only acceptable response to struggle was to make everyone else laugh? Let's talk about it in the comments. Your story matters. Robin Williams, the man who made millions laugh while drowning in silence. Robin McLaurin Williams was born July 21, 1951, in Chicago, Illinois. His mother, Lori McLaurin, was a Christian Science practitioner. His father was a Ford Motor Company executive who was rarely home. For young Robin, Christian Science provided the framework for understanding emotions. Pain wasn't real. Depression wasn't real. Mental illness was mortal error. Robin Williams was a profoundly lonely child. His father worked constantly. His mother was busy with church activities. The family lived in a massive 40-room mansion in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. Robin spent hours, sometimes entire days, alone in that enormous house. He would wander from room to room, creating characters, doing voices, performing for an audience of one. He'd make himself laugh because there was no one else to laugh with. This is where he learned the pattern that would define his life. When you're in pain, make a joke. When reality is unbearable, perform something else. When Robin was sick or hurt, the first response was prayer. When he was sad or scared, he was told these feelings weren't real. They were false beliefs to be corrected through spiritual understanding. So Robin learned not to share feelings. He learned to transform them. Sadness became comedy. Loneliness became characters. Fear became manic energy. By the time he attended Juilliard, Robin had perfected using comedy as armor. His classmate Christopher Reeve described him as uncontrollable in improvisation exercises, a whirlwind of characters and voices. What they saw as creative genius was also defensive mechanism. If you're performing constantly, no one sees what you're hiding. Robin's career exploded in the late 70s with Mork and Mindy. He became famous for playing an alien, appropriate for someone who spent his childhood feeling like he didn't belong on Earth. It also introduced him to harmful substances. For someone raised with Christian Science's emphasis on thought control, substance dependence presented a cognitive crisis. Christian Science taught that you controlled reality through thought, but dependence proved that matter had real, devastating power over consciousness. In March 1982, Charles, Robin's close friend John Belushi, passed from a combined substance overdose. Robin had been with him earlier that evening. Robin entered rehabilitation shortly after. He got sober for a while, but sobriety meant feeling everything Christian Science had taught him to deny: the depression, the anxiety, the emptiness that no amount of applause could fill. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Robin became one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Good Morning Vietnam, The Society of Poets, Good Will Hunting, for which he won an Academy Award. But friends consistently described the same pattern. Robin was on constantly in public, then he'd go home and the mask would drop. The depression was always there waiting. Robin saw therapists over the years, a clear rejection of Christian Science principles. He took antidepressants. He acknowledged that mental illness was biochemical, not spiritual failure. But even while getting treatment, Robin maintained the core pattern. Hide suffering, perform wellness, never let anyone see you're not okay. In his comedy, Robin made jokes about everything: his childhood, his divorces, his mother, but he never talked about Christian Science specifically, not anywhere. This silence itself is telling. Friends described him as two people: the public Robin, manic, brilliant, generous, and the private Robin, quiet, melancholy, sometimes barely able to get out of bed. In 2014, something changed. Robin started experiencing symptoms he couldn't explain: paranoia, anxiety attacks, tremors, difficulty remembering lines. He told his wife Susan that he felt like his brain was on fire. Robin Williams was suffering from Lewy body dementia, a devastating condition that causes hallucinations, severe anxiety, depression, and progressive cognitive decline. There is no cure, but Robin didn't know the diagnosis. He just knew something was terribly wrong. The anxiety became unbearable. The hallucinations were constant. He couldn't sleep. His wife Susan later described those final months as watching someone she loved disappear. Robin was losing his mind, and he was aware of it, she said. Can you imagine the pain he felt as he experienced himself disintegrating? For someone whose entire identity was built on his brilliant mind, losing that mind was the ultimate horror. On August 11, 2014, Robin Williams took his own life at his home in Paradise Cay, California. He was 63 years old. The autopsy later revealed the Lewy body dementia. Doctors said it was one of the worst cases they'd ever seen. Did Robin's childhood conditioning affect his willingness to seek help earlier? Did the internalized message that mental suffering was spiritual failure make him delay medical evaluation? We can't know. Robin never spoke publicly about his mother's faith or its impact on him, but we know this. His mother was a Christian Science practitioner who raised her son to believe mental suffering was illusion, that depression was mortal error, and that son spent his entire adult life battling depression, making millions of people laugh while privately drowning. Robin Williams made a career out of making pain funny. But comedy wasn't healing. It was performance. It was the skill he learned in childhood. When you're suffering, make everyone laugh so they don't see how much you hurt. After Robin's passing, the entertainment industry mourned the loss of a genius. They talked about his talent, his kindness, his generosity. What they didn't talk about was the silence. The silence about Christian Science's teaching that mental illness is mortal error. The silence about how many talented, suffering people learned to perform wellness instead of seeking help. Robin Williams spent 63 years making the world laugh. He passed alone in his bedroom, losing a battle against an illness that Christian Science taught him wasn't supposed to be real. His mother lived until 1986. She remained a Christian Science practitioner until her passing. Whether she ever questioned the faith's teaching about mental illness, whether she ever connected those teachings to her son's suffering, we'll never know. Robin never spoke about it, and now he never can. Christian Science taught him that mental illness wasn't real, but mental illness claimed him anyway, and the world lost one of the funniest, most brilliant performers who ever lived. Because he learned too young that pain was forbidden, that suffering was illusion, that the only acceptable response to drowning was to smile and make everyone else laugh. If Robin Williams' story just connected dots you never saw before, share this video right now. How many people do you know who had no idea about this connection? How many people still don't understand that mental illness is devastatingly, materially real, not spiritual failure? Share this. Let's break the silence Robin couldn't break himself. And then let's continue with Kelsey Grammer's story. Kelsey Grammer, the psychiatrist who couldn't heal himself. Alan Kelsey Grammer was born February 21, 1955, in St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. His parents were both committed Christian Scientists. Disease was illusion, pain was mortal error. Then reality shattered the illusion and kept shattering it, again and again. When Kelsey was 13, his parents divorced. That same year, his father was taken from him through violence in a home invasion. Christian Science taught that loss was illusion, but 13-year-old Kelsey's grief was real. In 1975, when Kelsey was 20, his younger sister Karen was 18. On July 1st, she finished her shift and left to meet her boyfriend. She never arrived. 3 days later, her body was found. She had been taken, violated, and harmed in the worst ways. Kelsey was 20 years old. His sister had been 18, and Christian Science taught him that suffering was illusion. The grief is annihilating. And your religion tells you this isn't real. Think correctly, and it will dissolve. But it didn't dissolve. The pain was real. In 1980, when Kelsey was 25, his two younger half-brothers passed in a scuba diving accident. Kelsey Grammer was 25 years old and had already lost his father to violence, his sister to violence, and two half-brothers to an accident. 4 family members gone. Kelsey was 25. In 1984, Kelsey got his breakthrough role, Dr. Frasier Crane on the sitcom Cheers. Frasier was a psychiatrist, a profession that Christian Science considered spiritually dangerous. The irony is almost unbearable. Kelsey Grammer spent 11 years playing television's most famous psychiatrist. Meanwhile, Kelsey was using alcohol and harmful substances to avoid processing his own trauma. In 1996, Kelsey attempted to end his own life. He was found in time and hospitalized. Psychiatric evaluation revealed severe depression and PTSD. Depression and PTSD are real psychiatric conditions. They require actual medical treatment Therapy, medication, genuine psychological intervention. Kelsey was finally forced to choose his religion or his survival. He chose survival. By the late 90s, Kelsey had largely left Christian Science. He started seeing therapists regularly. He took medication. He did the actual psychological work that Christian Science had taught him was spiritually dangerous. In 1993, Kelsey's show Frasier premiered. It ran for 11 seasons, won 37 Emmys. Frasier Crane was everything Christian Science denied. A psychiatrist who believed mental illness was real, who understood that healing required acknowledging pain rather than denying it. Kelsey Grammer is 69 years old now. He's been sober for years. He has said, "I'm grateful for therapy. It saved my life." Therapy, the practice Christian Science considers spiritually dangerous, saved his life. Medication helped him manage depression. Acknowledging trauma allowed him to heal. It took Kelsey 40 years to fully accept this. 40 years to let go of the religion that had taught him to deny what his heart knew was true. Val Kilmer, Christian Science in the Instagram age. 6 decades after Jean Harlow's passing, another Hollywood actor would face the same impossible choice between faith and survival. This time, social media was watching. This time, when he finally spoke again, it wouldn't be with his own voice, because Val Kilmer's voice is gone. Val Edward Kilmer was born December 31st, 1959, in Los Angeles, into a devout Christian Science family. When Val's younger brother Wesley lost his life in a drowning accident in the family pool in 1977, the family's Christian Science response shaped Val profoundly. For the Kilmer family, the Christian Science response was, Wesley hadn't really passed. The apparent loss was illusion. Val carried this faith into his adult career, becoming one of the few major actors of his generation who openly practiced Christian Science. In 2015, Val began experiencing throat problems, pain when swallowing, hoarseness, difficulty projecting his voice. Unlike the 1930s, when Jean Harlow's crisis could be kept private, Val existed in the age of social media. People noticed immediately. Michael Douglas made a public statement. Val had throat cancer and was refusing treatment for religious reasons. Val's initial response was classically Christian Science. He denied having cancer. He insisted he was perfectly healthy. Christian Bale reportedly confronted Val privately. Val's response was that his faith would heal him. Val's children, Mercedes and Jack, both expressed growing fear. They could see him deteriorating. They begged him to seek treatment. For approximately 2 years after symptoms first appeared, Val refused conventional medical treatment. During this time, the cancer progressed. By 2017, Val's condition had deteriorated to the point where he finally began treatment. His children had staged essentially an intervention. The cancer had spread enough that treatment required a tracheotomy. The tumor was removed along with significant portions of throat tissue. The procedure saved his life, but permanently altered his voice. Val Kilmer's voice, the voice that made Doc Holliday legendary, is gone, replaced by mechanical wheezing through a breathing tube. The voice that said, "I'm your Huckleberry," no longer exists. And here's the cruel irony. In 2020, a technology company used artificial intelligence to recreate Val Kilmer's voice. Now Val can type words into a computer, and the computer speaks them in a voice that sounds like Val Kilmer circa 1995. The man speaks through a ghost of himself, a digital recreation of what Christian Science cost him. Val lost approximately 2 years to Christian Science denial before seeking treatment. Those 2 years allowed the cancer to advance. That advancement necessitated more aggressive intervention. That intervention destroyed his voice. If he'd sought treatment in 2015 when symptoms first appeared, he might still have his voice. His children have spoken publicly about watching their father nearly slip away from what they saw as preventable delay. Mercedes Kilmer described the terror of watching someone you love choose faith over survival. From Jean Harlow's preventable loss in 1937 to Val Kilmer's 2015 battle, Christian Science shaped Hollywood for 80 years. 8 decades of the same pattern. Faith meets physical reality. Reality wins. People suffer. The silence that remains. By the 1980s, Hollywood's Christian Science presence had contracted to near invisibility. Studios quietly declined to cast known Christian scientists in major roles. Yet silence around Christian Science's Hollywood history persists. The children and grandchildren of Christian Science practitioners often don't want to publicly criticize their parents' sincerely held beliefs. Hollywood institutions themselves have little incentive to excavate this particular history. The Christian Science Church maintains its institutional silence. Jean Harlow, Ginger Rogers, Audrey Hepburn, Doris Day, and Val Kilmer weren't the only major stars affected by Christian Science in Hollywood. Recent research has uncovered at least a dozen more Golden Age performers who practiced the faith but kept it completely hidden from the public. Some were lost to preventable illnesses, but their Christian Science faith was successfully kept out of official records. This silence dishonors both those who found genuine comfort in Christian Science and those who suffered because of it. These aren't attacks on religious freedom. They're documentation of what happened when sincere faith collided with physical reality. Studios wanted to sell glamour, youth, invulnerability. Christian Science taught that acknowledging physical vulnerability gave it power. Both parties benefited from silence. The only losers were the stars themselves. These stars lived in silence. We're breaking it. Jean Harlow was 26 years old. She should have had 40 more years of work, of marriage to William Powell. She lost all of it because her mother valued theological consistency over her daughter's life. Ginger Rogers danced with effortless joy while forbidden from seeking treatment for her injured knee and trapped in her mother's psychological grip for 7 decades. Audrey Hepburn weighed 88 pounds and ate tulip bulbs at 16, then spent 40 years feeding starving children as if trying to save the child she had been. Doris Day lived to 97, but unable to grieve her son for 11 years. Val Kilmer built a career on his distinctive voice before. Christian Science conviction led him to delay treatment until that voice was permanently altered. They were all beautifully and tragically human, but they were also artists of extraordinary talent who created work that continues to move audiences. Their art transcends their suffering, but knowing the full story allows us to honor them more completely, not as perfect icons, but as real people whose talent made beauty despite, and sometimes because, of their pain. These stars lived in enforced silence for decades. Today, we're giving them a voice. Their silence is over. Let's make sure it's heard. If this documentary opened your eyes to a Hollywood story that's been buried for nearly 90 years, I hope you'll subscribe to Golden Age Files. We're building a community dedicated to telling the complete stories, the beautiful, the painful, and the complicated truths that shaped the legends we love. Hit that like button if you believe these stars deserved better than silence. And drop a comment sharing which story affected you most, or if there's a Golden Age mystery you'd like us to investigate next. These stars spent their lives performing for us. The least we can do is remember them honestly. Until next time, remember, the truth is always more powerful than the image. Thanks for watching and for helping us break the silence.